Buddhism says, fear comes from attachment. Let go of what you cling to. Fear dissolves. Stoicism says, fear comes from false judgment. Examine your fears rationally. Most are illusions. Vedanta says, fear comes from forgetting you're eternal. Remember Atman. What is there to fear? Taoism says, fear comes from resisting the flow. Accept what comes naturally. Fear loses power. 4 paths through fear. But when your heart is pounding and your hands are shaking, which one works? Before we begin, let's clarify what we're talking about. Bhaya, in Sanskrit, means fear. One of the fundamental emotions that Buddhism and Vedanta analyze deeply. Fear of loss, fear of pain, fear of death, fear of inadequacy. Abhaya means fearlessness, not recklessness, not the absence of danger, but the absence of fear in the face of danger, a state of inner freedom. Premeditatio malorum is the Stoic practice of visualizing your worst fears, not to traumatize yourself, but to remove the power fear has over you. When you've mentally rehearsed the worst, it can't ambush you. Prosos is the Greek concept of vigilant attention, watching your own thoughts, your judgments, your reactions, because fear often comes from the stories you tell yourself, not from reality. Fortitudo is Latin for courage. But Stoic courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting virtuously despite fear. Doing what's right even when you're terrified. Wu Wei applied to fear. Don't add mental resistance to what's already difficult. Don't make fear worse by fighting it. You have fear. Fear of failing. Fear of being rejected. Fear of losing control. Fear of being alone. Fear of not being enough. Fear is universal. But these 4 traditions say, you don't have to be a slave to it. There's another way. Here is an ancient story from the Buddhist tradition. Devadatta was the Buddha's cousin. He envied the Buddha. He wanted to be the leader. So he conspired to kill him. His plan was simple. Unleash a war elephant. Make it drunk. Enrage it. Release it onto a narrow street where the Buddha would be walking. The elephant came thundering down the street. People screamed, scattered, ran into buildings. The Buddha's disciples begged him, "Master, run. The elephant will kill you." The Buddha didn't run. He stood still, calm, watching the elephant approach. The elephant roared, charged forward. The ground shook, a few meters away. Then, the elephant stopped. It looked at the Buddha. The Buddha raised his hand gently. No fear, no aggression, just presence. The elephant knelt, lowered its head, became docile. The disciples asked, "Master, weren't you afraid?" The Buddha replied, "Fear comes from attachment. Attachment to the body, to life, to self. When you see there is no permanent self, what is there to protect? Without attachment, there is no fear." We live in an age of anxiety. Anxiety disorders have skyrocketed, especially since the pandemic. People who never struggled with fear suddenly find themselves paralyzed by it. The media amplifies fear. Terrorism, crime, disease. Every headline designed to trigger your fear response. We fear failure. Perfectionism paralyzes. Better not to try than to try and fail visibly. We fear social judgment. FOMO, fear of missing out. Constant comparison. The terror of being seen and found lacking. There's a whole culture built around comfort zones. Stay safe. Don't risk. Don't grow. Because growth requires facing fear. And underneath it all, existential fear. Fear of insignificance. Fear of not mattering. Fear of being forgotten. But here's the paradox. We live in the safest time in human history. Statistically, you're less likely to die violently, to starve, to be killed by disease than at any point in the past. But emotionally, we feel more fear than ever. Why? Because fear isn't about real danger. It's about perception, about the stories we tell ourselves, about what we think might happen. Self-help says, be brave. But it doesn't teach you how. These four traditions don't say don't be afraid. They say work with fear, transcend fear, use fear, but don't be dominated by it. Buddhism begins with an analysis. Where does fear come from? Tanha, craving, attachment. You're attached to something, and fear is the shadow of that attachment. You're attached to your reputation, so you fear humiliation. You're attached to your health, so you fear illness. You're attached to your relationships, so you fear abandonment. The Pali Canon lists 5 universal fears: fear of losing loved ones, fear of losing property, fear of disease, fear of damaged reputation, fear of public speaking. Notice the pattern? Each fear protects something you're clinging to. The Buddha's teaching is radical. Let go of what you're clinging to, not because you don't care, but because clinging creates suffering, including the suffering of fear. When you see through anatta, no self, fear loses its grip. There's no permanent self to protect. What are you defending? This doesn't mean you become reckless. The Buddha wasn't reckless. He was careful, strategic, but he wasn't afraid, because he wasn't protecting an ego. Buddhism teaches metta, loving kindness, as an antidote to fear. When your heart is filled with goodwill toward all beings, including yourself, fear has less room. The Metta Sutta says, even as a mother protects with her life her child, her only child, so with a boundless heart should one cherish all living beings. Fear contracts. Love expands. They can't occupy the same space. Vipassana meditation reveals the nature of fear. Watch it arise. Physical sensations, heart racing, breath shallow, tension in the stomach, just sensations, temporary, changing, not you. Don't fight the fear. Don't feed it. Just observe it, like watching clouds pass. Fear arises, fear passes, everything does. What Buddhism offers: freedom through non-attachment. Fear loses power when you release what you're trying to protect. What to watch out for? Letting go can become cold indifference, not caring about anything. But that's not what the Buddha taught. Care deeply, just don't cling desperately. And fearlessness can be misunderstood as recklessness, taking unnecessary risks. But true abhaya is wisdom combined with courage. Try this practice. Next time fear arises, name it. Fear is present. Not, I am afraid. That creates identification. Just, fear is present. Observe it like a cloud passing through the sky of your awareness. Now Stoicism enters with a different approach. Stoics say, fear comes from false judgment. You judge something as terrible. But is it? Examine it rationally. Most fears are about things outside your control. You fear losing your job, being rejected, getting sick, dying. But the dichotomy of control teaches, you don't control outcomes. You control effort, intention, response, character. When you fear what you can't control, you're wasting energy and creating unnecessary suffering. Seneca wrote, we suffer more often in imagination than in reality. Think about that. How many times have you been tormented by fears that never came true? How much life have you lost to imaginary disasters? The Stoics practiced premeditatio malorum, visualizing the worst-case scenario, not to traumatize yourself, but to remove fear's power. You're afraid of losing your job. Visualize it. You're fired. Then what? You look for another job. You reduce expenses. You adapt. You survive. Maybe even thrive. Most terrible scenarios are manageable. When you visualize them calmly, they lose their terror. Epictetus taught, people are disturbed not by things but by the views they take of them. It's not the event that frightens you, it's your judgment about the event. This is catastrophic. Is it? Or is it just difficult? Examine your fears. Break them down. Often you'll find the fear is irrational, based on false premises, inflated by imagination. But what about legitimate fears? Real dangers? The Stoics taught fortitudo, courage, not the absence of fear, but action, despite fear. Marcus Aurelius was afraid. He wrote about it in his private journal. But he acted with virtue anyway. That's courage. You don't need to eliminate fear to be courageous. You need to act rightly, despite fear. And memento mori, remember death, actually reduces fear. The worst thing that can happen? You'll die. It's already certain. So what else is there to fear? When you've accepted the ultimate fear, smaller fears lose their power. What Stoicism offers, courage through reason. Examine your fears. Most are irrational. Act virtuously despite the rational ones. What to watch out for? This can become emotional suppression. Real men don't feel fear. But Stoics felt fear. They just didn't let it control them. And rationalization can dismiss legitimate fears. Your gut instinct, your intuition. Sometimes fear is wisdom. Try this practice. List your biggest current fear. Ask, is this in my control? If no, why fear what you can't control? If yes, make a plan. Fear without action is wasted energy. Now Vedanta offers a third perspective. Vedanta says, fear comes from identification. You think you are this body, this ego, this vulnerable, temporary form. But you're not. You are Atman, eternal consciousness. And Atman cannot be harmed. The Brihadaranyaka Upanishad teaches, where there is duality, one fears the other. But where everything has become the self, who is there to fear, and whom? Fear requires separation, me versus threat. But when you recognize, everything is Brahman, there's no separation, no other to fear, you fear failure. But who is failing? The ego, not the Atman. The Atman witnesses success and failure with equal serenity. You fear death. But who is dying? The body, not the Atman. The Bhagavad Gita says, as a person sheds worn-out garments and wears new ones, the soul sheds worn-out bodies and enters new ones. You fear judgment. But who is being judged? The persona, the mask, not your true self. When you rest in the knowledge of what you really are, consciousness itself, fear dissolves, because nothing can harm consciousness. Vedanta teaches karma yoga as a practice. Act without attachment to results. When you're not attached to outcomes, you don't fear them. The Bhagavad Gita says, you have a right to perform your prescribed duties, but you are not entitled to the fruits of your actions. Do your best, fully, completely. But the result, not in your hands. Releasing the result releases the fear. What Vedanta offers, fearlessness through knowledge. When you know you're indestructible, fear loses its foundation. What to watch out for, I'm eternal, can justify reckless behavior, ignoring real dangers, but wisdom includes taking care of the temporary vehicle, the body, that houses consciousness, and this can become dissociation, checking out emotionally. Nothing can hurt me, used to avoid necessary vulnerability. Try this practice. When fear arises, ask, who is afraid? The ego fears. The body fears. But I, the witness, observe the fear. Rest in that witnessing awareness. See if the fear shifts. Finally, Taoism offers a fourth way. Taoism says, fear comes from resistance. You're resisting the natural flow, trying to control what can't be controlled. Wu Wei, non-forcing, dissolves unnecessary fear. When you stop fighting reality, fear loses much of its intensity. Think of water. Water doesn't fear obstacles. It flows around rocks. It doesn't resist. It doesn't fight. It adapts. Naturally. Effortlessly. The Tao Te Ching says, there is no greater misfortune than wanting more, no greater disaster than discontentment, no greater fault than greed. Much of your fear comes from wanting more success, more approval, more control, more security. Simplify. Return to Pew, the uncarved block. The simpler your desires, the less you have to fear losing. Zhuangzi wrote, the perfect man uses his mind like a mirror. It grasps nothing, refuses nothing. It receives but does not keep. No grasping, no refusing, just flowing. Fear diminishes dramatically when you stop trying to control everything. There's a difference between natural fear and neurotic fear. Natural fear, you see a tiger, you run, is healthy. Part of survival. The Tao doesn't oppose that. But neurotic fear, anxiety about things that might never happen, constant worry, paralyzing perfectionism, that's resistance. That's not natural. That's you fighting the Tao. Wu Wei applied to fear. Don't add mental resistance to what's already challenging. The situation is difficult. Don't make it worse by panicking about it. What Taoism offers, peace through non-resistance. Fear diminishes when you stop fighting against the flow of life. What to watch out for? Flow with everything can become passivity, not standing up against injustice, not protecting yourself when necessary. Wu Wei isn't surrender to harm, and Taoism can lack the moral urgency of Stoicism. Sometimes you need to act courageously despite fear, not just flow around problems. Try this practice. Identify something you're mentally resisting. Ask, what if I stopped resisting? What if I accepted this as happening? See if the fear decreases when the resistance stops. Now let's test all four with a real scenario. You have a significant opportunity, a career change, starting a business, a serious relationship, a major move. But you're afraid of failing, afraid of judgment, afraid of losing what you have. What does each tradition say? The Buddhist response: examine this fear. Where does it come from? Tanha, craving. You want success. That's attachment. You fear failure. That's aversion. You want approval. That's attachment. You fear judgment. That's aversion. Practice vipassana with the fear. Feel it in your body. Racing heart, sweating palms, just sensations, not your fear, just fear happening. Ask yourself, if I fail, then what? Temporary suffering. But everything is anicca, impermanent. Failure passes, success passes. Why let temporary fear prevent action? Practice metta toward yourself. Compassion dissolves fear. May I be happy. May I be free from suffering. May I act with wisdom. Then act, not because you have no fear, but because fear is just a temporary sensation, not the commander of your life. The Stoic response: apply the dichotomy of control. What do you control? Your effort, your intention, your virtue. What don't you control? The outcome. Others, approval. External success. You're afraid of things you don't control. That's irrational. Practice premeditatio malorum. Imagine the worst. You fail publicly. You lose money. People laugh. Then what? You survive. You learn. You start again. Marcus Aurelius said, "The mind undisturbed is an impregnable fortress." Examine the judgment. This is terrible. Is it? Or is it just difficult? Terrible is losing virtue. This is an opportunity to practice courage. Fortitudo, courage, isn't the absence of fear. It's acting with virtue despite fear. Memento mori. You're going to die. Maybe in 50 years, maybe tomorrow. With that horizon, does this fear matter? Act now. Virtuously, courageously. The worst that can happen: death, which is already guaranteed. So why not try? The Vedanta response: your fear comes from identification. You think you are the ego that can fail, but you're not the ego. You are Atman, eternal consciousness. External failure doesn't affect Atman. External success doesn't affect Atman. Practice karma yoga. Act without attachment to results. What I have a right to action, but not to the fruits of action. Bhagavad Gita. This means, do your best. Fully. But the result, not in your hands. Releasing the result releases the fear. Ask, who fears failure? The ego fears. But I, the witness, observe the ego fearing. I don't fear. I witness fear. Act as an instrument. Does Dharma call you to this action? Then act. Without ego claiming credit in success or shame in failure. Remember tattvam asi. You are that. You are Brahman, indestructible, Complete. What is there really to fear? The Taoist response. Fear comes from wanting to control the outcome, but the Tao controls outcomes, not you. Wu Wei, stop resisting. Did this opportunity arise naturally? Then flow with it. Are you forcing it, pushing against natural timing? Then maybe it's not time yet. Feel the timing. Forcing against fear is resistance. Acting naturally, despite fear, is Wu Wei. Practice Ziran, naturalness. A tree doesn't fear growing. Water doesn't fear flowing around rocks. Why should you fear following your natural path? Simplify. Pew, the uncarved block. How much of your ambition is complicated ego? If you release neurotic ambition, would this fear still exist? Accept. If you try and fail, that's the Tao showing you a different path. The Tao doesn't judge success and failure the way you do. Act lightly, like bamboo bending in wind, flexible, not rigid with fear, not stubborn with ego, just natural. All four traditions offer a way through fear, but different ways. Buddhism. Fear comes from attachment. Release what you're protecting through observation and compassion. Stoicism. Fear comes from false judgment. Examine rationally. Act courageously despite fear. Vedanta. Fear comes from identifying with ego. Recognize your eternal nature. Act without attachment. Taoism. Fear comes from resistance. Stop fighting the flow. Simplify. Act naturally. Which is most practical? That depends on the fear. For immediate anxiety, Stoicism's dichotomy and premeditatio work quickly. For long-term freedom, Buddhism's gradual training in non-attachment. For existential fear, Vedanta's recognition of eternal nature. For fear caused by overcomplication, Taoism's return to simplicity. You can use insights from all. But when real fear comes, heart pounding, hands shaking, which practice do you reach for? That reveals your philosophy. Fear is universal. All four traditions acknowledge this, but they disagree about the source and solution. Buddhism. Fear comes from attachment. Let go of what you're trying to protect. Practice metta. Watch fear pass. Stoicism. Fear comes from false judgment about things outside your control. Examine rationally. Act courageously despite fear. Vedanta. Fear comes from forgetting Atman. Remember who you really are. Indestructible. Act without ego. Taoism. Fear comes from resisting natural flow. Stop fighting. Simplify. Flow. What would you do if you weren't afraid? And what's actually stopping you? Real danger or imagined disaster. Fear stops you, but sometimes anger moves you. Anger can destroy, but can it also create justice? Can rage be righteous? Next video we shall walk through the feelings of anger and justice, when to fight, when to let go. Stay tuned. See you there.